The story of a survivor who testified against Nazi doctors at the doctor's trial. I could never look at a syringe the same way again. I could never look at a syringe the same way again. Not even vaccine syringes. They paralyze me. Because when I see one, I remember what I saw in that place. I was just a boy, but my memory was seared like fire in my flesh. The scene that never left me was that of a girl. Maybe she was my age. She was strapped to a gurney, and a man in a white coat was injecting something into her, as if he were testing a formula on a rat. She screamed, but he smiled. He was a doctor, they said. But doctors save lives, and he was taking hers. Years later, when I sat before the judges at Nuremberg, my hands shook. It wasn't fear. It was hate. For the child I was, for the girl on the gurney, for all those who never made it out alive. And that's why I'm telling you today. Because if I forget, they win. Subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with the best and censored accounts of World War II. Like and comment on what you think of the accounts, okay? Let's continue with the story. Before everything, before the screams, the uniforms, the rusty trails, the shadows that swallowed people whole, I was just a boy. An ordinary boy. With an ordinary last name. With a family that loved me and a street where everyone knew my name. I was born in Lodz, Poland. My father was a shoemaker, the kind who still measured a customer's foot and made the shoe right there in front of them, seam by seam, sole by sole. My mother, a sweet woman, soft-spoken and calloused, cared for everything and everyone with a kindness that seems almost impossible to me today. I had 2 younger brothers, and we shared the same room. We slept cramped, it's true, but we laughed a lot. In fact, I think we laughed a lot, because my father was always saying it was impossible for anyone to work with so much noise coming from upstairs. In the late afternoons, the smell of fresh bread wafted through our window. Dona Helena, the neighbor across the street, baked the sweetest bread in the neighborhood. She always gave me a little piece, even though she said I only stopped by for free food, laughing as she wiped her hands on her apron. And maybe it was true. On Saturdays, we went to synagogue. Not because we were very religious. My father, in fact, was more skeptical than pious, but because it was part of who we were. It was our way of keeping something alive within us. Something ancestral. I studied, helped my father in the workshop sometimes, played in the street with my friends. There was a boy named Jakub who made me laugh until my stomach hurt. He said he was going to be a theater actor when he grew up, but I knew he was afraid to even speak loudly in front of his mother. And I didn't know what I wanted to be. Maybe a doctor, like Uncle Avram, who wore a lab coat and round glasses and had a strange way of smelling of alcohol and mint at the same time. Life was simple. Nothing grand, but enough. And there was one thing back then that only those who've experienced it can understand. Security. I felt safe. Inside the house. On the street. With my parents. With my neighbors. It never crossed my mind, not even for a second, that that world was numbered. But it was. I remember the day I first saw soldiers marching through the city streets. They didn't knock. They kicked. They didn't look you in the eye. They just passed by, cold as ice, hard as stone. I remember the yellow star they sewed on my clothes. The shame I didn't understand, but felt. I remember the whispered conversations, the radios suddenly turned off, the frightened looks on street corners. I was just a boy, but something in the air had changed. It was as if the wind had grown heavier, as if the adults had forgotten how to laugh. The streets fell silent. Helena stopped baking bread. The shoe my father had promised to deliver was left unfinished on the counter because the customer had disappeared, or was taken, as they said. The synagogue was burned down. And that night, I heard my father cry for the first time. Little by little, everything disappeared. The routines, the friends, the smells, the sounds. The very notion of normalcy dissolved, until it went up in smoke. Until one day, there was a knock on our door. But this time, it wasn't to ask anything. It was an order. A list of names. A truck waiting outside. We were taken to the Lodz ghetto. There, hunger wasn't a condition. It was a permanent state. Rats competed with children for scraps. There was cold, disease, lines for everything, even to die sometimes. I saw neighbors fall to the ground and never get up again. I saw mothers offering their last pieces of bread to their children and then fainting. And even in that hell surrounded by walls, fences and soldiers, I still thought it was the worst thing that could happen. But I was wrong. So wrong. The worst was yet to come. Worse, he wore white. He had a scalpel in his hands. And he called what he did science. But before that, there was a night that never left my mind. I was 14. We were huddled in a room in the ghetto, trying to sleep. We could hear gunshots in the distance. And suddenly, a whisper came through the broken window. Tomorrow they'll start selecting. I didn't know what it was, but my mother knew. And in that instant, her eyes changed. She hugged me strangely, as if trying to imprint the shape of my body on her memory. And she whispered something I've never forgotten. If they separate you from me, run. But never look back. The next morning, everything changed. Trucks arrived. Screams. Dogs. Officers with lists. And the first selection took place. We were separated. My father, my brothers, and I went one way. My mother, the other. She tried to smile. She tried to pretend everything was fine. But when they turned our backs and told us to move, I heard a sound that wasn't a scream, not a cry. It was like the sound of a heart breaking. And I didn't look back. For the first time, I didn't obey my mother. But I never saw her again. There's a kind of fear that creeps in. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It settles in slowly, like mold on the walls of the soul. At first, it's just a feeling, a discomfort in the stomach, a stiffness in the neck. Then it grows. And before you know it, it's already living inside you. That's how fear came to me. It didn't come with a bang. It came in silences. Little things that began to disappear. My mother's smile, my younger brother's silly jokes, the smell of Mrs. Helena's bread, which stopped baking overnight. I remember one Saturday when I went to my father's workshop and found him standing there, his hands stained with paint, staring into space. There was an unfinished shoe on the workbench. But he didn't see it. He stood there for hours, motionless, as if listening to something only he could hear. Back then, rumors began. Families disappeared. Shops closed. They said they were being taken to the countryside to work in factories. No one knew for sure. But those who left never returned. And that was what frightened me more than any news, the emptiness that remained. The closed houses. The unmade beds. The dishes still on the tables. Soldiers began to circulate through the city more frequently. They marched in groups, in heavy boots, rifles slung over their shoulders. They never looked at us. They didn't need to. Their mere presence was a warning. No one confronted them. No one looked at them. It was as if we had been transformed into shadows, allowed only to exist on the margins. And then came the order. A new rule: all Jews were to wear a yellow star on their chest. From that moment on, there was no more pretending nothing was happening. The symbol was a stamp. A sentence. I remember the day they sewed the star onto my clothes. My mother did it in silence. She sewed steadily, her eyes wet. I watched her, standing, trying to understand why she looked sadder than ever. When I finished dressing, I saw my reflection in the mirror. For the first time, I didn't recognize myself. It was as if a part of me had been ripped away, an invisible but essential part. At school, I was excluded. Not directly, but the way people looked at me changed. Classmates avoided contact. Teachers pretended not to see me. One day, I came home and my backpack was ripped, cut with a razor. Inside, someone had written, "Jewish trash." That hurt more than any slap. Because it was the first time I understood. I was no longer just a child. I was an enemy. Shortly after, we were forced to move to the ghetto. They called it relocation. A clean word for a dirty deed. The truth is, we were crammed together like objects, pushed into an isolated part of the city, surrounded by walls and armed soldiers. I remember the last night in our house. My father stared at the door for hours, as if waiting for someone to return and tell me it was all a mistake. My mother blew out the candles with trembling fingers. And I just sat on the floor, leaning against the bedroom wall, watching the shadows dance across the ceiling. I knew I was leaving. I just didn't know I would never return. The Lodz ghetto was a place without time. Inside, days and nights blended together. There was mud in the streets, bodies on the corners, and sunken eyes everywhere. Hunger was a living creature, crawling between the houses and slowly devouring. I saw children fainting from lack of food. I saw men eating potato peelings from the ground. I saw mothers trading their rings for a piece of moldy bread. But the worst wasn't that. The worst was the fear. It was everywhere, and it could transform into anything: a knock on the door, a distant whistle, the sound of approaching trucks. When the trucks came, everyone cowered. It was the signal for a new selection. The selections were just that: soldiers invading the houses, dragging people through the streets, pointing out who was going and who was staying. No one knew where they were taking them. We only knew that whoever was going disappeared. I still have nightmares about those mornings. The screams, the cries, the thrown suitcases, the broken doors. Once, I saw an old man being dragged by his hair because he couldn't walk. He screamed for help. No one helped. No one could. If you tried, you were next. In that environment, I learned to keep quiet, to breathe softly, to walk slowly, to be invisible. Because in the ghetto, survival was an art, and the slightest mistake could cost you your life. It was in this setting that one day I received the news. My name was on the list. My heart stopped for a moment. I was going to leave. But where to? I didn't know. I only knew that those who left didn't return. My mother was no longer with me. My father was too weak to react. My brothers, one had already disappeared in a previous selection, and the other trembled in silence, clutching a dirty blanket. On the appointed day, they lined us up. Men on one side, women on the other. I remember the smell. It was something between iron, sweat, and despair. We were silent. All that could be heard were the soldiers' footsteps and the sound of papers being read. We were put into trucks, and then into freight cars. Freight cars, closed, cramped, windowless. The door slammed. Darkness took over. And there began the part of the story no one wanted to tell. The part where we became numbers. The part where I met the doctors. But that, I'll tell you later. I still remember the sound of the wooden doors closing behind us. It was as if the world had gone silent. A dense silence. Not the peaceful silence of a calm dawn, but the kind of silence that screams inside your chest. That makes your bones vibrate. The kind of silence you feel when everything alive seems to be being erased. They packed us into a freight car as if we were animals, or worse, as if we were nothing. About 80 people in a space that barely held 20. There were no benches, no windows, just a small opening at the top, through which a dim, dirty sliver of light filtered. The floor was raw wood, damp with dew and fetid from previous journeys. There were marks in the corner, scratches, stains, dried blood. I didn't want to look for long. Part of me already knew what it meant. The gate slammed shut. The padlock echoed like the end of a sentence. And then, the journey began. No one knew where we were going. In the ghetto, they talked about labor camps. Some said it was better than staying there. Others simply said nothing. They had that dead look in their eyes, as if they were already at the end, even while standing. At that moment, I could only think of two things: whether I would see my father again, and whether I would ever return home. even without knowing if my home still existed. The first few hours were the worst. People pushed and shoved. They cried. They prayed. They tried to make room where there was none. An old man fainted early on, perhaps from the heat, perhaps from fear. A woman screamed incessantly, calling for her son who had been left behind. 2 young men tried to force open the door, pounding it with their hands until their fingers bled. One of them looked at me and said, almost laughing, "They're going to bury us standing up." And, in a way, they were. There was no water. There was no food. The only relief was a small can in the corner of the car, which served as a bathroom for everyone. With each jolt of the tracks, the pain intensified. Bodies collided. Muffled screams. The creaking of wood. The smell. Oh, the smell. A mixture of sweat, urine, fear, and death. Time lost all meaning inside. We didn't know if it was day or night. The darkness was constant, interrupted only by pauses in the train, each stop a threat. Sometimes they'd open the door for a few minutes, throw a bucket of water on the floor, or shout someone down. And then, everything would close again. As if we were trapped inside a mechanical lung, breathing pain with each thud of the wheels on the track. I remember a child near me. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She wasn't crying. She didn't say anything. She just held a piece of cloth, it looked like a handkerchief, and pressed it to her face as if it were the only thing connecting her to reality. At some point during the journey, she stopped moving. Her mother tried to wake her. She screamed. She shook her. But the girl didn't respond. So the woman just hugged her, and remained there, motionless, for hours, like a statue made of pain. Around her, no one said anything. Fear had swallowed us whole. The strangest thing is that, at some point, your body begins to accept the absurd. You stop fighting. You stop screaming. You stop questioning. You enter a strange state of torpor. It's as if your mind is saying, if you want to survive, forget you're alive. That's how I survived the transport. I erased part of myself. I hid inside my own head. I became a ghost among ghosts. After days, I don't know how many, the train finally stopped. For good. The silence outside was different. It wasn't the silence of the forest. It was an urban silence, metallic, empty. The kind of silence that precedes something terrible. Then we heard it, voices shouting in German, dogs barking, whistles cutting through the air like blades. And suddenly, the doors opened. The light stabbed into my eyes. I had to blink several times before I could see. What I saw, I've never forgotten it. Men in uniform shouted orders while dogs charged at those who tried to flee or hesitate. We were on a platform, surrounded by watchtowers, barbed wire, armed soldiers. Signs in German. And, ahead, the gate. Above it, the inscription that so many knew and so few returned to tell. Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. It was a lie. But at that moment, we didn't know it yet. They pushed us out of the cars. Some fell. Others were dragged. There were screams. Gunshots. An old woman who refused to leave her husband's body was shot in front of everyone. I remained silent. Still. As they taught me in the ghetto, invisible. The line formed. Long silent. Men to one side. Women to another. Children. Some stayed with their mothers. Others disappeared among the soldiers. And it was there, in that line, that I saw for the first time a man in a white coat. He didn't carry a gun. He didn't even shout. But his gaze was worse than any rifle. He looked at us like someone choosing meat at the butcher's. As if he were calculating, measuring, deciding who was worth something and who could go straight to the trash. Later, I discovered who he was. Joseph Mengele. But that day, he just pointed. Left. Right. Right. Left. Every movement of his hand was a life or death sentence. When I stood before him, I tried to look strong, tall, healthy. I didn't know what to do, but something inside me said, Look useful. Look usable. He looked at me. His eyes were cold, emotionless. And he pointed. Right. I didn't know what that meant. But I followed. And that was the beginning of my new life. If the ghetto was hell, that camp was the abyss itself. And the white coat, it was the devil's uniform. The first thing I noticed when I entered the camp was the smell. It wasn't just smoke, it was something heavier, denser, a mixture of burnt flesh, sweat, feces, chemicals, urine, and fear. Yes, fear has a smell. And in that place, it seeped into your bones. The gate closed behind us with a bang that felt final. From that moment on, we were no longer people. We were units, pieces, objects to be used or discarded. They ordered us to take off our clothes. Everything. In front of armed soldiers, agitated dogs in different gazes. Some hesitated and were beaten. Others cried. I only remember taking off my shirt with trembling hands, staring at the floor, trying to forget I existed. After that, we were taken to a room with showers. And at that moment, a question exploded in everyone's mind. Was it gas? Some already knew. Others, like me, had only heard muffled rumors. No one spoke. But their eyes spoke volumes. The doors closed. And the water fell. Real water. That day, they let us live. We were erased like ancient documents. They shaved our hair. They shaved as if to erase every trace of identity. They cut away every last strand of who we were. Then they gave us gray clothes, all the same. No names. No references. Just a number. Mine was tattooed on my left arm. That's what I was now, a number. They put us in wooden barracks. The beds were stacked planks. 3 levels. We slept stacked like sacks of potatoes. And if you fell during the night, you never got up. Hunger became a constant companion. We received thin soup in the morning, more water than anything else, and a piece of stale bread at night. It wasn't long before they started fighting over scraps. I saw brothers stealing from their own brothers. I saw one man kill another for a piece of bark. I myself considered doing the same, more than once. But what truly turned that place into what I can only call a living hell was what came after the count. The daily counts. That damned routine where we were lined up, silent, for hours, in the cold or the heat, with soldiers walking among us, ready to kill the first one who moved. And sometimes, they called us to work. Sometimes, to disappear. Almost always. And it was on one of those occasions that they called me. But not to work in a factory. Not to move stones or carry rails. They called me for what they called medical selection. I still didn't quite understand what that meant. They placed me with other young men, most of them with strong, healthy bodies. We were taken to a different, more isolated barracks, where I saw for the first time. I saw the white coats up close for the first time. There, everything seemed cleaner. But make no mistake, it wasn't a place of healing. It was a theater of pain. A laboratory of horrors. They lined us up. And then, he appeared again. Joseph Mengele. The angel of death, as many would later call him. Tall, elegant, in an impeccable lab coat. He smiled as if he were about to begin a concert. His eyes shone, but not with empathy. It was excitement. Like someone who had just opened a new toy. He walked among us like an artist observing his canvas. He pointed. He took notes. He touched some people's shoulders. When he stopped in front of me, he pursed his lips, studied my face, measured my chest with his hands, and said something to the assistant next to him. After that, I was separated. Taken to another room. There, I saw the marks on the floor. I saw the smell of ether mixed with blood. There were metal tables, surgical instruments, vials of yellowish liquids, syringes of all sizes. And then, they began. At first, they tested my reflexes. Then, injections. No one could tell me what they were. I felt pain. burning, nausea. There was a day when my vision went out for hours. Another when I trembled non-stop until nightfall. I saw children with their eyes sewn shut. I saw twins being dissected alive, one for study, the other for comparison. I saw men with limbs amputated just to study tissue regeneration. I saw women being forcibly sterilized. I saw bodies discarded as hospital waste. And everything was done with records, notebooks, notes. As if it were science. As if it were progress. But it was pure cruelty masquerading as research. There was no cure. There was no treatment. There were only experiments with pain as the method and death as the natural outcome. And the worst part was that some of us began to be grateful not to die. Even if it meant living maimed, blind, in unbearable pain, without identity, without hope. Survival was the new prize. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest torture of all. At the end of that month, or week, I'm not sure, I was returned to my barracks. But I was no longer the same. Not in body. Not in soul. The camp doesn't just kill. It molds. Reshapes who you are. And what's left can barely be called human. But somehow, I kept going. Breathing. Silent. Alive. I still didn't know why. But one day, I would know. I don't know why they chose me. Some said it was my age, others my body. I was young, healthy, thin, with visible muscles despite the hunger. Maybe it was just bad luck. Or maybe they were just rolling dice, like gods playing with the pieces of their own macabre game. All I know is that one morning I was taken from the barracks and taken back to that medical wing. The same too-clean corridor, the same metallic sounds, the same smell of blood disguised by ether. It was as if death itself wore a white coat in that place. As if science had been tortured until it became a dark caricature of itself. This time there were no questions. Only orders. Lie down. Don't move. Open your mouth. And then, pain. It wasn't pain like a fall, or a broken bone. It was planned pain. Cold. Surgical. It was the kind of pain that came slowly, settled, spread, and then burned for hours like an internal fire. Injections that burned my veins. Substances that made my skin swell as if it were about to explode. Injections that left everything dark and cloudy, as if I were drowning in ink. I remember one time when they strapped me to a stretcher and injected a liquid into both arms. The assistant wrote everything down, as if he were recording a cake recipe. 5 minutes, redness. 10 minutes, blisters. 15 minutes, bleeding. I screamed and begged, but no one looked at me like a human being. I was just a variable. A number. And the worst part was their calm. Mengele walked between the stretchers as if he were visiting an art gallery. He praised the assistant's work, like a teacher satisfied with his student's performance. Sometimes he stopped, observed my reactions with clinical curiosity, and said things like, "Interesting. Let's do it again tomorrow, but with a different level of concentration." The other day, they put one of us, a boy my age, in a cold chamber. The goal was to study the human body's resistance to freezing. He stayed there for hours, naked, shivering, grinding his teeth until his gums bled. When they opened the door, he could no longer move. His muscles had seized. The look in his eyes. I'll never forget it. It was the look of someone already gone, even though his body was still trapped there. The next day, it was my turn. I was placed in a tub of ice water. My skin hurt as if it were being cut by 1,000 invisible blades. My fingers turned purple. I lost the feeling in my legs. They told me it was for medical reasons. What was it for? I never knew. Maybe it was useless to them. Just curiosity, or pure cruelty. Other experiments involved cuts, dissections. They took pieces of our skin, our muscles. Sometimes they sewed them back together. Sometimes they didn't. Infection was common. Fever was constant. And yet, we were kept alive, or rather, kept functioning. Because they didn't treat us like life. They treated us like test equipment. The nights after these procedures were the worst. My body trembled with pain. My mind swam. Sometimes I forgot my name. Other times, I remembered simple things, and it hurt even more. The smell of my father's workshop. My brother's laughter. The taste of warm bread for breakfast. Missing my old life was almost as unbearable as the cuts. Because I remembered who I was. And the more I remembered, the more distant I felt from that someone. I was fading away. I remember one day, after another experiment, when I was put back in the shed, covered in blood, covered in pus, my eyes burning from within. An old man approached. He didn't say anything. He just covered me with a torn piece of cloth. I didn't know who he was. Maybe he didn't know anymore either. But in that gesture, I felt a shred of humanity. A flicker. As if there was still something that resisted, even in that hell. Of course, not everyone resisted. Some went mad. One man talked to himself for days, calling for his mother who should have been dead for months. Another bit his own wrist until the bone showed. There was a boy who threw himself against the electric fence. When his body fell, the soldiers laughed. They laughed. Their death was a spectacle. The pain, routine. The hope, a joke. I wondered every day why I was still alive. Sometimes I thought it was punishment. Other times, I thought maybe God wanted me to see it all. To remember it. To somehow tell it. But back then, the only thing I wanted was to forget. To forget the sound of the syringe being pressed. To forget the smell of cauterized flesh. To forget the screams that came from the other side of the wall. To forget that my body no longer belonged to me. To forget that, with each day I survived, others died in my place. I don't know how many sessions of experiments I endured. I lost count. I lost track of time. Sometimes she woke up with wounds she didn't remember receiving. Other times, she dreamed she was free, only to wake up with the metallic taste of pain in her mouth. But, somehow, I stayed alive. Maybe because I became empty inside. A vessel. A blank notebook where they wrote their horrors. Or maybe, because my story wasn't over yet. I asked myself that question thousands of times. Why did I survive? Why did my friends die in the cameras, on stretchers, in the snow pits, and I stayed? Why was I spared, even though I was just another number? What was the criterion? Luck? Cruelty? Or just convenience? I saw hundreds of people taken away and never returned. Strong men, pregnant women, children still sucking their thumbs. I watched it all with a sinking stomach, feeling the bitter taste of fear stuck in my throat, but unable to do anything. Sometimes I felt cowardly. Other times, I felt guilty. As if living were a sin. The truth is, surviving in a camp like that wasn't an act of heroism. It was an accident. I didn't eat more than the others. I wasn't smarter. Nor was I stronger. There were days when I thought about giving up, about stopping fighting, about stopping breathing, about letting myself die slowly, just to be done with it. But there was something inside me, a remnant of instinct, perhaps. An invisible thread that pulled me back every time I sank too low. As if a voice whispered in the darkness, "Not yet." And perhaps that "not yet" saved me. But the price. Oh, the price. Waking up every day surrounded by corpses. Sleeping next to bodies rotting with no one strong enough to bury them. Seeing the looks on the faces of those who gave up while they were still breathing. It changes you. I became someone I no longer recognized. My eyes had lost their light. My movements were automatic. I no longer felt hunger, or cold, or anger, only fatigue. A fatigue that was heavier than any physical wound. It was the weight of carrying the memory of the dead. There was an unwritten rule inside, don't get attached to anyone. But how? How could you not bond with someone who shared the same piece of stale bread? How could you not connect with the one who held you when you fainted from weakness? We were bloodless brothers, victims of the same nightmare. And every time one of those brothers fell, a part of me died with them. There was a man, his name was Aaron, who shared my bunk. He was a tailor before the war. He sewed fine suits for wealthy men. In Auschwitz, he sewed body bags. But still, he told me stories as if we were two old friends on a bench. Of the enlisted man. When this is all over, he would say, "I'll teach you how to sew a jacket." He never left. Another was Eli, a skinny boy, about 3 years younger than me. He had big, curious eyes. Sometimes he smiled, even inside, as if to remind everyone that we were still human. One day he was taken for testing, and came back with his feet bandaged, 3rd-degree burns. He could no longer walk. We tried to hide it from the guards. We cared for him. We gave him what little we had. But the fever came, and took him away in the cold, early morning. I didn't cry. I couldn't cry anymore. The tears had dried up along with everything I felt. And still, I survived. I can't say how. There were days when I really thought I wouldn't make it past morning. Times when I woke up spitting blood. Others when the pain in my legs was so bad I could only crawl. But somehow, I kept going. I dragged myself through the mud of existence. I held on to the pain like a rope. And I began to wonder, why? Why were they keeping me alive? I began to notice that the guards looked at me differently. Maybe it was because I endured the experiments without fainting. Maybe because I no longer begged. Or maybe because, by torturing me so much, I became useful. An efficient guinea pig. Good material. The idea sickened me. Surviving there meant being useful to evil. That was what destroyed me inside. Knowing that my life was being spared not out of compassion, but because I served their purpose. Because my body would hold. Because I wouldn't break, or at least, not in front of them. The biggest lie they tell about concentration camps is that death is the worst punishment. It isn't. The worst punishment is surviving to the point where you stop caring. I became a shadow, a reflection. I no longer dreamed of freedom, only of silence, of a moment of peace. A minute without orders, without screams, without the piercing pain of the needle piercing my flesh. And even in those moments, I felt guilty. Because every time I gained another day of life, another died. Survival, in that place, was a form of prolonged mourning. And deep down I knew, if I ever got out of there, if this nightmare ever ended, I would carry with me all the faces, all the voices, all the bodies that disappeared into the ashes. Because to survive is to remember. And to remember is to suffer again. But it is also to resist. And that was what kept me going. The idea that, perhaps, someday, someone would hear my story. And understand. You would understand that surviving wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. And that telling all this now is the only way to honor those who couldn't. There was a moment when death stopped coming. It, which walked beside us every day, silent, methodical, predictable, suddenly vanished. Not with fireworks. Not with cries of freedom. It was with silence. A silence so strange it felt more like an omen than a salvation. I woke that morning with a metallic taste in my mouth, as if I'd bitten off my own fear in my sleep. Around me, no one moved. Some seemed dead. Others just exhausted. But there was something in the air. Something different. A sound that wasn't there. The screams. They had stopped. No rouse. No sound of boots hitting the concrete. No sirens. No gunshots in the distance. The gate was wide open. At first, we thought it was a trap. Many had seen tricks like this before. Open the gate, wait for the desperate to run, and shoot like game. Then no one moved. Me neither. I lay there, my body broken, but my mind racing. The silence was almost deafening. I could hear my heart pounding, as if trying to escape from my throat. And then, I saw a figure at the entrance. He wasn't a German soldier. It was a man in a strange uniform, with a red cross on his arm. Then others came. They had flags embroidered on their jackets, different from the ones we were used to fearing. One of them spoke in English, another in Russian, a third in French. That's when I understood. They came. The war outside, the one that for so long existed only in whispered rumors in the barracks, had reached us. Not as a new punishment, but as an end. Or rather, a new beginning. But a new beginning has its own horror. Because liberation isn't like in the movies. There's no triumphant music. There are no smiling crowds. There are bodies. Piles of bodies. There are eyes that don't believe. Languages that have forgotten how to speak. Legs that can no longer stand. The smell of death doesn't fade just because the gates have opened. As the soldiers entered, some wept. I saw one of them fall to his knees, choking as he looked around. The expression on his face wasn't one of victory. It was shock. Because nothing prepared them for this. They expected to find prisoners. They found ghosts. I stood up with difficulty. Each step felt like a challenge to the impossible. My bones cracked, my muscles trembled. I walked between the barracks, unsure of where to go. And then I saw, outside, they were setting up tents, medical tents, and food areas. They were trying to welcome us. But many were no longer among the living. I sat near a makeshift fire. I felt the heat on my skin and cried for the first time in months. I didn't cry for myself. I cried for Aaron, who didn't live to see that day. For Eli, who might be buried under the snow. For the girl on the stretcher. For all those who died without knowing the war would end. That freedom, however crooked and delayed, would come. A soldier approached and handed me a chocolate bar. Chocolate. I looked at it as if it were a sacred jewel. I didn't eat it right away. I kept it as proof. A symbol that all of this wasn't delusion. That perhaps, in fact, I was free. But how do you live after hell? How do you become human again when all they did to you was teach you to be less than an animal? The following days were hazy. They took us to a triage center. Doctors examined us, photographed us, asked questions. There were journalists. There were questions. But there was also distrust. Some looked at us as if we were dangerous. Others as if we were objects of study. But most didn't know what to do with our pain. One of the soldiers asked me my name. I told him, and he replied, "Now you are free, Samuel." Free. What a strange word. For a long time, freedom was just an idea for me. An empty sound. Something that happened to others, in other places. Now, it was mine. And I didn't know what to do with it. I wandered the fields like a shipwreck survivor, waiting for someone to tell me what to do. Waiting for someone to say it was all just a nightmare, that I could go home. But there was no home anymore. My city, reduced to rubble. My family, all dead. My name, forgotten by the world. All that remained of me was this thin body, this cracked soul, and a memory filled with screams. It was at that moment that I realized my freedom came with a new mission. To tell, to bear witness, to be the eyes and the voice of those who didn't make it out alive. And when they asked me if I would be willing to speak, to testify in court, against the doctors, against those who had used me as a guinea pig, I said yes. Not because I was brave, but because someone needed to remember. Because someone needed to cry out for all those who remained silent. And if I survived, maybe that was why. When I walked into that room, it didn't feel like a courtroom. It looked like a mausoleum. A temple built not for the living, but for the dead who still screamed in our bones. It was immense, solemn, illuminated by a light too white, too cold, almost cruel. The tall windows filtered the day as if the sun dared not invade that space. Inside, the air was thick. And it wasn't just the gravity of the trial, it was the weight of the ghosts that walked with us. They led me to my seat. I was trembling. I had been hungry, thirsty, cold. I had seen children dying in silence, men reduced to walking skeletons, people treated like lab rats. But there, in that moment, my hands sweated as if death were staring me in the face once again. But it wasn't death. It was him. He was there, sitting, impeccable, in a suit, hair combed, glasses polished, like a teacher, like any doctor, like someone you would trust to care for your child. But I knew, I saw, that man before me, the one now called defendant, was the same man who had once held a syringe and inserted it into the vein of a crying child, begging to return to his mother. Dr. Karl Brandt. There were others. Mengele wasn't among them, but many were. Faces I recognized like someone recognizing a recurring nightmare. They were doctors, scientists, surgeons. Men who swore an oath to save lives, and chose to use it to destroy them methodically and coldly. I remember the judge calling me, "Mr. Samuel Weiss, please take the floor." My throat went dry. I stood up like someone ascending the scaffold. Not for fear of dying, but because I knew that by speaking, I would have to open the doors of my memory. And inside, there were monsters. I began by telling my name, my age at the time of my capture, the camps I'd been through, Dachau, Buchenwald, and finally, the name that took the breath from my lungs, Auschwitz. I spoke of the smell of burning flesh, of the barrels of fluid used for sterilization, of the freezing experiments, of the injections into the eyes of twin children. But it was when I mentioned the names of the victims I could remember, that the room fell into absolute silence. It was as if time itself had stopped to hear them. David Stein, 9 years old. Leah Hirsch, 11 years old. Tomasz Nowak, 6 years old. Anna Meller, 10 years old. Every name I said was a knife spinning in the center of the room. The lawyers turned. Some of the defendants lowered their eyes. Others stared at me coldly, as if I were an inconvenience. As if my suffering were disrupting the order of things. There were translators, journalists, military personnel. But when I spoke, it was as if we were alone. Me and them. The survivor and the executioners. The prosecutor asked me, "Do you recognize any of the defendants here?" My hand trembled. I looked at them, one by one. Yes. My voice trailed off, but I continued. "That man over there." And I pointed. He didn't even look away. He just stared at me, as if to say, "So what?" And that's when I realized something terrible. They didn't regret it. Not a single bit. Most of them didn't cry, didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't tremble. They were sure of their choices. For them, what they did was science, order, ethnic cleansing, a greater project. And that coldness hurt me more than the guards' punches. Because if a man is capable of killing a child and sleeping peacefully, then evil isn't just a mistake. It's a decision. The defense attorney tried to discredit me. He asked why I had survived, suggesting that perhaps I had collaborated. I tried to answer firmly, but my voice wavered. Because, for a moment, he planted a doubt in me. What if I was only there because I was useful? But then I remembered. I survived to tell. To be there. To look those monsters in the eye and say, "I remember." Not to avenge, but to expose. Not to scream, but for the world to hear. When I finished my testimony, the judge thanked me. But that thank you sounded strange. As if ordinary words couldn't touch what I had just relived. I stepped down from the bench like someone returning from a war. Because yes, testifying is a battlefield. And every memory is a buried bomb, ready to explode when you least expect it. Some journalists came to talk to me afterward. One of them asked, "How did you manage to survive?" I simply replied, "I don't know." because it was true. Maybe luck. Maybe irony. Maybe punishment, living with those memories. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that justice isn't revenge. Justice is memory. It's saying the names. It's making the world hear, even when it prefers to forget. And in that cold room, among translators and defendants, judges and ghosts, I was heard. After testifying in that courtroom, I thought the truth would finally find its place. That the voices muffled by the horrors of the camp would be heard, recognized, respected. But I was wrong. The reality that awaited me outside that room was more complex and painful than I could have imagined. When I returned to the free world, that world where I no longer knew who I was, I realized that not everyone was ready to listen. Some looked at me with doubtful eyes, others with a mixture of fear and revulsion. For many, my story was so unbelievable it seemed like a lie. How could anyone have survived that hell, if the news from the concentration camps was so terrible, so unbelievable? Many didn't want to believe because believing meant facing the darkest face of humanity, and that was too frightening. I remember well the first public debate I participated in, shortly after the trial. It was a modest gathering, but for me, it was a moment of extreme importance. I wanted everyone to know, for everyone to feel the weight of what I had experienced. But I faced skepticism from academics and politicians who tried to downplay the stories. Some said they were exaggerations, that the propaganda of the victors of the war had distorted the facts. Others claimed it was an isolated incident, a small blip amid the chaos of war. These words hurt me like whips. How could I prove to them that the fire, the cold, the hunger, the injections, the chambers, and the screams were real? How could I show the invisible scars that the body and soul bore? I knew that survival carried a weight, carrying not only my own pain, but that of millions who never had a voice. I began traveling, speaking at schools, churches, and conferences. Each time I told my story, I felt some people's eyes blur into tears, others look away, and still others react with disbelief. It was an emotional roller coaster. With each account, I relived everything. But I understood that this was the price of memory, because to forget was to allow it to happen again. Many asked, "How did you endure all that?" The answer was never simple. There was no mystical force or saving deity. Just a thin thread, a barely existent hope that one day humanity might learn from its own cruelty. There was an episode that will never leave my mind. During a lecture, a man raised his hand and said sarcastically, "This is all an exaggeration. An exaggerated testimony to create victimhood. War is full of horrors, yes, but his account seems like fiction." At that moment, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. I could only say, "I was there. I saw. I lived." But for him, for many, doubt was ingrained, and that was more painful than any scar. Over the years, I've seen that humanity has an incredible capacity for denial. It's easier to turn our faces away from horror than to face it. Many have tried to bury the stories, erase the evidence, destroy the archives. Memory, which is a right of survivors, has become a constant battle. But I also found hope. I found people who listened, who believed, who fought for the truth to be recognized. Organizations dedicated to preserving memory, educating new generations. Museums, books, films. Everything so that history would not be forgotten, so that never again would cease to be empty rhetoric. I understand today that my testimony is not just about me. It is about those who died without a voice, about those who were silenced forever. It is a warning against the indifference and cruelty that still haunt our world. So, even with all the weight, even with all the pain, I chose to speak. Because silence is complicit in forgetting, and forgetting is complicit in repetition. If you are listening to me, know that the story I told is not a tale from the distant past. It is a lesson for the present and a warning for the future. We must gaze into the abyss so that it never again swallows us. And so, between horror and skepticism, I continued on my way. An arduous but necessary road. Because memory is the only weapon against the tyranny of silence. Bearing witness to all this was not just an act of courage. It was a sentence, a burden I carry to this day, in every part of my body and in every corner of my mind. Being a witness to what I experienced, what no human being should ever witness, changed me forever. There's no going back, no forgetting, no erasing the images that burn into my memory. When I left the camp, I thought the greatest pain would be physical, the scars on my body, the hunger, the cold. But I soon realized the true torture was something else. It was carrying in my soul the weight of those who never returned. It was remembering every day the smell of death and the sound of screams that never completely silenced. It was knowing that my survival was also an invitation to constant suffering, to relive the nightmare with each memory. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night with my heart racing, feeling the grip of fear as if I were still surrounded by barbed wire and shadows. And when I look at my hands, I think of how many times they were tied, pierced, marked, but also how many times they tried to touch, comfort, hold on to the life that insisted on escaping. I carry with me the silence of those who could never speak. And it is this responsibility that keeps me going. Because it's not enough to survive, you have to tell. Tell so that no one forgets. Tell so that the horror is never repeated. Tell so that the victims' voices continue to echo, even when time tries to bury them. Sometimes I wonder if the world has learned anything. I see that humanity is still lost in hatred, prejudice, and intolerance. I see that racism, authoritarianism, and violence continue to haunt our streets and hearts. And then I feel a new fear, a fear that the past has not been enough to teach. But I also see hope. I see young people who want to understand, who seek to learn from the mistakes of their ancestors. I see people who fight against injustice, against silence, against oblivion. My role, my mission, is to be a guardian of this memory. Even when it hurts. Even when the memory weighs heavy. Even when the questions have no answers. Because bearing witness isn't just reliving horror. It's keeping the flame of humanity alive. And if you're listening to this story, I want you to know, the story I've told isn't just mine. It's the story of millions. It's the story of all of us. May we learn from the pain of the past to build a future where respect for life, dignity, and justice are the foundation. And if one day you feel lost, discouraged by the cruelty of the world, remember that there are those who resisted, who survived, and who continue to fight for light to overcome darkness. That's why I'm still here. Still speaking. Still remembering. Still resisting. And if you want to hear more stories, reflect with me on the horrors and lessons of history, subscribe to the channel. Because together, by keeping memory alive, we can make a difference. Never forget, memory is our weapon against the silence of evil. After everything I've experienced, after everything I've witnessed, I understood that my story didn't end with survival, not even with judgment. The real struggle began when silence threatened to swallow everything. The voices, the faces, the names. It's easy for time to erase the marks of pain, for history to be rewritten by those who want to forget or deny the past. But I couldn't allow that. I knew that if the memory of the horrors I experienced were lost, the world would be doomed to repeat them. Therefore, my mission became clear. To be the voice of those who have been silenced forever. Every time I tell my story, every time I talk about the experiments, the camps, the pain, I feel like I'm keeping a faint flame burning against oblivion. This flame isn't just mine. It belongs to all who died in that darkness, and to all who, even today, face oppression and injustice in the world. But memory is a difficult weight to bear. Many prefer to turn their faces away from the truth, seeking comfort in denial or indifference. I understand this impulse. I too wanted to run away. I wanted to forget. But the truth always returns. And if we don't face it, it can turn into something even worse. The legacy we carry isn't just one of pain. It's also one of resilience, of humanity, of hope. For years, I've witnessed that even in the darkest moments, life finds a way to cling to the thread of hope. I've seen simple gestures, like sharing a piece of bread, a silent hug, a sympathetic look, acts that remind us that, even in hell, we are human. And that's why I believe my mission goes beyond the past. It's a call for the present and the future. Today, I face a new kind of battle, that of memory versus forgetting, of truth versus lies, of love versus hate. In a world where fake news spreads rapidly, where intolerance resurfaces in different forms, it's more important than ever to keep real history alive. I want you, who are listening, to know that history should not only be remembered in books or museums, but lived in everyday life, through education, empathy, and the fight for justice. Every name I mentioned, every face I carried in my memory, is a reminder of what is at stake. Not just for us survivors, but for all of humanity. I cannot erase what happened, nor can I erase the pain I carry, but I can transform that pain into strength. Strength to denounce evil. Strength to educate. Strength to build bridges where walls once stood. If my voice can reach you, know that you are not alone, and that together we can create a world where respect for life and human dignity is the solid foundation for a different future. Therefore, I ask you, who want to hear more, who want to reflect, who want to be part of this mission, to subscribe to the channel. Don't allow the past to become just a distant shadow. May the flame of memory be kept alive, because remembering is resisting, and resisting is surviving. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for keeping this story alive, our story. I know words may seem insufficient in the face of what I experienced. The horror surpasses any speech, any account. But even so, here I am, speaking to you, trying to transform pain into warning, silence into voice. 4 years, I carried an invisible burden. A burden I didn't choose, but one imposed on me by history, by fate, by the cruel chance that caused me to be there, in that hell. And now, my responsibility is greater than ever. Because time passes, and oblivion lurks, and with it, the danger of the past repeating itself. The doctor's trial was not just a page in history. It was a cry against impunity. It was an attempt to set limits to evil. But evil knows no bounds unless human conscience says, no. I look back at the faces that never returned, at the voices that were silenced, and I make a plea. Don't let indifference bury them again. The memory of those dark days must be a light that illuminates the darkness of ignorance and prejudice. A light that reveals the dangers of cruelty disguised as science, of hatred disguised as order, of power disguised as justice. Each of us bears a responsibility, not just to remember but to act, to say no to hatred, to denounce injustice, to fight for a world where no one need fear the worst that human beings can do. I know it's difficult. I know it's painful, but it's necessary, because if we don't learn from the past, we will be condemned to relive it. And the story of those who suffered and died for our freedom will be in vain. I survived to tell the story. I survived to be the voice of those who were silenced. And today, I ask you to listen, to learn, to pass this story on. Not for revenge, but for humanity. Not for hate, but for justice. Not for sadness, but for hope. If my story touched you, if it made you think, feel, wake up, subscribe to the channel. Join me in this mission to keep memory alive, to resist oblivion, to build a future where respect for life is sacred. And always remember, true justice begins when we look truth in the eye, without fear, without omission. I didn't choose to live this story, but I choose now to share it, so that no one ever has to. Thank you for being with me this far. May memory never die. May justice never be silenced.